Absolutely right. Hopefully that's better. Can we start with declarations of interest? Wonderful, that's a great start. Any apologies for absence and substitutes?
Yes, Chairman, we have apologies from Councillor Wymark and his substitute is Councillor Clancy.
Okay, welcome Councillor Clancy. Should also say welcome to Councillor Toval. I think it's your first proper meeting on this committee, so welcome. Number 3, minutes of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting held 11th of July. I have to say I looked over these some weeks ago with you when you were actually writing them up. So it looked good to me then, but I could go to our resident in-house minutes expert, Councillor Empsall. Be happy? It's always nice to be known for having a specialism, isn't it? So I'm sure you're brilliant at many things, Councillor Empsall, but that's where you're my go-to man on these issues. So we're all happy to accept them. Thank you. Chairman's announcements. I don't have any announcements to make. Does the Vice Chairman have anything he would like to say?
He does.
Great. Do I have to switch on? There we go.
Are we on?
Yeah.
I think we should pass comment on the fact that the papers arrived for our scrutiny very late on Friday afternoon. Too late for many of us to actually access them easily. Furthermore, there were further additions to the agenda made this afternoon, which I haven't had a chance to see, and I don't know whether other people have. So I think it's fair to say that members of the opposition would like to register their concern about this and the fact that it should not be repeated, because if we're to do due diligence in overview and scrutiny, we need to have the papers in good time and not over a bank holiday weekend just before the Friday close.
I know that it's probably not for me necessarily to go into the reasons behind that, but I know that the Cabinet had asked for the chance to actually see the minutes of their Cabinet meeting before it was published online, because they wanted to be able to actually see and discuss what they were going to be discussing before it was shared with us. Because I was in the building similarly waiting to have a meeting with Emma and about the minutes, and I was waiting and they were literally hot off the press when I was here about 3:30, 4 o'clock, and the Cabinet meeting had literally just finished.
Whatever the reason, I think it's fair to say that it's not acceptable and it shouldn't be the norm going forward. So can I ask for some reassurance on that, please?
I'll pass this over to Emma and ask her to make comment on it.
Yeah, absolutely, Chair. I mean, I would add to what you said. Obviously, it has been the holiday period. That isn't an excuse, but the holiday period does make reports more difficult to get those finalised. And obviously, we need to make sure that we've cleared those with Cabinet before the agenda is issued. There are quite complex papers in front of you, and as I've already discussed, officers will take you through in details of those because we recognise the reports came through late. Absolutely, it's not the way we have worked and it's not the way that we plan to work, but unfortunately that is where we find ourselves today. But I have asked officers to give full briefing as if you've not read the papers so that you have full understanding.
I can certainly empathise. I can remember being leader of the opposition on the council and we were sent important financial documents about the cooperation agreement on building control, and we were sent it half an hour before a full council meeting once and expected to debate and discuss it, and I was sent it at 6:30. So we have at least given you several multiplications of that half-hour notice I was once given on a very important matter.
Don't feel reassured somehow.
But I do empathise.
The point's made.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's taken. Shouldn't switch that off. Public speaking? I don't
No public speaking, Chair.
see anyone here. Wonderful. Okay, we'll start on point 6 then. Cabinet reports. Agenda item 7, risk management policy refresh, which is on page 12, and I believe we've got lead officer Sinead Carey.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the report you have in front of you today is an overview of the refreshed risk management policy. And this is following a scheduled review of the policy and has previously been to the last audit committee and has been endorsed. So just by way of background, so the policy, which you'll find in Appendix 1, was set back in 2020 originally following a risk maturity assessment that we carried out. Section 2.2 of the report provides an overview of the key features of the policy that has been developed. This includes the framework for how we deliver our risk management, our risk appetite, roles and responsibilities, and the scoring guidance that we use for our risk registers. So since the risk policy was set in 2020, a lot of work has taken place to embed best practice in terms of ways of working with risk management, and that's led us to establish a number of new initiatives, such as the Strategic Risk Register, which comes to Audit Committee and Cabinet 3 times a year, alongside integrating risk into our performance and finance reports, which get reported into Cabinet quarterly. We've also rolled out risk identification and management guidance to all staff, and we also have a training programme in place, particularly focusing on new staff coming into the organisation so they can understand our risk management and risk appetite. And earlier this year, we asked our internal audit team to do a position statement for us, really to understand how far we have come since we first rolled the risk policy out in 2020. And that recommended a number of small amendments and additions to that current policy, which I've set out in section 4.1 of the report. They're small amendments, mainly focused around embedding better working practices with CLT, our corporate leadership team, when engaging in particular with portfolio holders and members on risk. So in terms of the recommendations, we're seeking for Cabinet to recommend the proposed refresh policy to Council. And I'll pause there for any questions.
Thank you very much. Do any members have any comments or questions they would like to ask at this point? Wow, that's good. You must have done an outstanding presentation. Thank you. That's the first time we've had any presentation so far under this council that no one's wanted to comment on. So can I thank you for that? And are we all happy to go to a vote and to accept this? All those in favour?
To be unanimous, Chairman?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sinead. We now move to looking through my agenda and getting confused where I'm at. To item 8. Yeah, that's right. It's just in the border. There you go. Agenda item 8. Council and registered provider status, which is on page 31 of our minutes. Lead officer Hazel Ellard, who will talk on this, and others. Apologies.
Chairman, if I may, just a few words of introduction before Hazel gets started. Good evening, members. Good to see you all. The next 3 items, 2 of which are part of exam papers, really come as a package of papers, and it's provoked by our ongoing considerations about how we both make sure we provide the right residential support and options to our residents in a challenged environment, but also how we consider our property management endeavours as a council and as one team supporting 2 councils. So it's fair to say that the housing sector continues to be really quite challenged, both by way of the demand we're seeing in the system for housing support, driven by COVID, driven by the cost of living crisis, which is ongoing, and driven by external factors such as asylum dispersal and supporting those guests from Ukraine, but also in terms of the supply environment, with challenged delivery of housing development and also the private rented sector market, which is significantly worse than it has been in the past. It really was the bold and I think universally supported decision to expand our temporary accommodation estate taken back in November of last year that stimulated us as an officer team to start to consider whether we've got the right infrastructure in place in order to manage both our residential but actually on a bigger footing our wider property estate. And so really these next 3 papers, first of which from Hazel is looking at the registered provider status of the council, but the 2 exempt items that follow around local authority housing funding and property management arrangements more generally all are really part of that same package of considerations. So, Chair, I just wanted to offer that little bit of context, particularly bearing in mind the news that some people haven't had the ability to read the papers. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. So this is a report on council and registered provider status, and the report sets out the council position as a social housing provider and the requirement to register Broadland District Council with the regulator for social housing as a registered provider. Sorry, it's quite a complex report and there's quite a lot of legislation in there, but hopefully I've managed to make it clear. So it basically sets out, because the council owns the freehold of properties, but also leases properties, that it's therefore a provider of social housing because it provides accommodation that's let at below market rents to people in housing need. And it's made available for rent. So it includes both the freehold of properties that the council owns and also the leasehold properties that the council provides leases for to people who require the accommodation. The requirement under the regulator is quite specific, and it says that if you are providing social housing, therefore, or you intend to provide social housing, you therefore fall under the regulator. The Broadland District Council has taken legal advice from MP law, which is quite specific and says that it falls under the regulator and is a registered provider for social housing. Just so you're aware, South Norfolk Council has taken the same advice from Burkitt's, which came to the same conclusion, as have other local authorities in Norfolk, and two have registered with the regulator this year. So that's kind of quite clear in that respect. In terms of the rents, so the regulator has a rent standard which is set out in its guidance, and the rent standard covers social rented housing which should be let at formula rents. So formula rent is set by the regulator, it's based on a property valuation, a calculator that's specifically set out in the rent standard. Where the council owns the freehold of properties, they fall under this rent standard because they don't meet the definition of temporary social housing. There's a specific definition of temporary social housing which I've set out in 2.6, which says that if the council owns a freehold essentially, or provides housing on leases which don't meet that third definition under definition of temporary social housing, that they need to provide those properties at formula rents. Now, formula rent is a rent roughly about 55% of market rental value, so it's kind of equivalent to a social rent. So where we own the freehold of properties, we own the two freehold properties in Broadland District, but obviously we're acquiring more for temporary accommodation, that those would need to be charged on a formula rent. With a formula rent, you can have a service charge on top. So the service charge covers costs associated with managing and maintaining the communal areas in a property. So if you've got a large property that's got a lot of communal areas, then the service charge will be higher. And the service charges need to be proportionate, and that again is set out by the regulator as well. So kind of give you a bit of a background really in terms of how the council meets that definition of social housing and falling under the regulator. A local authority can own up to 199 dwellings before it has to have a housing revenue account. So we're a long way off that because we've got 2 and we're looking at purchasing 7 more. So we're a long way off that. So the recommendation based on the legal advice is the council registers with the regulator. Just to make you aware as well, I've included some benefits of being a registered provider. So for example, the council, if it chooses to, could access Homes England funding to fund more affordable housing developments, and in some instances registered providers are not subject to stamp duty and land tax on acquisitions. So those are kind of some of the benefits. You'll also be aware recently of the Social Housing Regulation Act, and the regulator taking a more proactive stance to regulatory standards. And I've set that out in an appendix just to give you an idea of the new powers of the regulator for social housing, because they're taking a more proactive stance to regulation and enforcement. It was just to give you a bit of background really about what's coming in April next year, and obviously the consequences of becoming a registered provider and what standards and requirements we will need to meet. Although the regulator will not check on us, they could do if they find issues are reported to them. So it's to give you a bit of background information on the potential costs associated with the new Act. Under the new Act, there are some consultations happening at the moment, so not all those matters that I've raised in the appendix have been considered yet, but will be consulted on by the regulator. before it comes into force next year. Hopefully that's a kind of good summary. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions or comments on what has been said? Wow. I thought we'd done it. Thank you. Yes, Vice Chair.
So in short, we need to register in order to be legally compliant. Is that right? Is that right?
Yeah, the legal advice is such, and I think it's fair to say that other local authorities, there have been quite a lot of local authorities who've registered recently, and I think that also comes about because of the Local Authority Housing Fund, which we're discussing next, and because more councils are owning more stock and providing, but yes, that's essentially it.
Councillor Lehman first, and we'll go to Councillor Murrell.
Thank you. I note from this there will be some extra costs, some staff and financial resourcing to be considered, and it says it'd be prudent to set a budget, including a staff training budget. So have we any idea what we're talking about?
We haven't set a budget, more because they were consulting on various elements of it. We know, for example, that housing managers will need to have qualifications, so obviously there'll be costs associated with those. But I think in terms of management maintenance, it probably doesn't impact on that so much. It's just what's required under these new, and the tenancy engagement and what that looks like, so the costs associated with that. But perhaps Jamie would want to respond.
Thanks, Hazel. All I would observe is that we've got the opportunity to consider the budget pressures through the budget setting process, which will start in gusto in October, November time. So we'll of course pick up any considerations then, and it's worthwhile giving ourselves the time to properly understand the obligations on us before we set our budget in haste.
Councillor Lamming stole my thunder. That was my question precisely, was just around resources and budgets and how this was all costed out going forward.
I propose that we take this to the vote. All those in support and favour of this, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4,
14? Oh, you were voting 15.
Yeah.
That was unanimous then.
Thank you very much. I guess, yeah, you're down for later things anyway, aren't you? So may as well remain seated whilst I go through the procedure for item 10, exclusion of press and public. I move that the press and public be excluded from the meeting for the remaining items of business, because otherwise information which is exempt information by virtue of paragraph 3 of part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act of 1972, as amended by the Local Government Access of Information Variation Order of 2006, would be disclosed to them. Trying to read it in the most interesting way possible.